Your soulmate is asking you to see a big truth about yourself right now, and this isn't coming to you loudly or dramatically, it's arriving in a quieter way that only reaches people who are finally ready to listen, because the truth they want you to see isn't about fixing yourself or becoming someone else, it's about recognizing something you've been carrying without realizing how heavy it's been, and if you feel a strange pause in your chest right now, like something just slowed the world down for a second, that's your signal not to scroll away. Stay with this, because this message is for you and it's unfolding exactly when it needs to. There's a reason your soulmate hasn't rushed toward you yet, and it has nothing to do with timing mistakes or missed chances. It's because there's a part of you that learned to survive by shrinking, by becoming agreeable, by being the one who understands everyone else while no one fully understands you. And your soulmate sees this more clearly than you do. They can feel the cost of it, the quiet exhaustion behind your kindness, the way you give grace even when your own heart is tired, and they are asking you, gently but firmly, to see that this pattern isn't love, it's protection that stayed too long. You didn't become this way by accident. You learned early that being easy to be around felt safer than being fully seen, so you taught yourself not to ask for too much, not to expect consistency, not to name your deeper needs out loud, and for a long time that strategy worked. It kept the peace, it avoided conflict, it helped you survive moments when love felt uncertain. But your soulmate is connected to the version of you that doesn't need to survive anymore, and they're asking you to recognize that the old rules no longer apply. This is the part where many people get uncomfortable, because seeing the truth about yourself means admitting that some of the pain you experienced wasn't just done to you, it was also reinforced by what you accepted, by what you normalized, by the way you stayed silent when your soul wanted to speak. And this isn't blame, this is power, because your soulmate isn't coming to rescue you from this pattern. They're coming to meet you after you release it. Right now, your soulmate feels you standing at a threshold. Even if you can't fully name it yet, they sense that you're questioning old beliefs, old dynamics, old versions of yourself that no longer fit, and they're asking you to see one big truth clearly. You don't need to earn love by being patient with what hurts you. Real love doesn't require you to diminish yourself to be chosen. There's a reason your heart has been restless lately, why familiar connections feel empty or repetitive, why conversations that once felt normal now leave you feeling unseen. This isn't loneliness, it's alignment recalibrating, and your soulmate knows that if you don't recognize this shift, you might mistake comfort for destiny again, and they don't want to meet you in a life where you're still negotiating your worth. Your soulmate isn't asking you to become harder, colder, or less compassionate. They're asking you to become clearer, clearer about your boundaries, clearer about your needs, clearer about what you will no longer explain or justify, because they are prepared to love you without confusion, but they can only do that if you stop confusing yourself about what you deserve. If you've been seeing repeating signs, numbers, or moments of sudden clarity lately, this is part of that message. The universe doesn't interrupt people who aren't ready, and this truth isn't meant to overwhelm you, it's meant to free you, because the moment you see it, you stop attracting situations that require you to abandon yourself to feel loved. Your soulmate has already imagined meeting you as you truly are, not the version that overextends, not the version that waits in silence, not the version that hopes someone will finally notice how much you give. They're drawn to the you who speaks honestly, who trusts their inner knowing, who understands that love doesn't arrive as confusion disguised as intensity. This is why certain connections had to end or fade without closure. They were mirrors, not destinations. They showed you what happens when you ignore your inner voice, and your soulmate doesn't judge you for that. They honor the journey that brought you here, but they are asking you to learn from it before you step into what's next. There's a specific truth they want you to hold close right now. You are not too much when you ask for consistency, you are not demanding when you ask for emotional presence, and you are not ungrateful when you refuse to settle for half measures. These beliefs were taught to you by environments that couldn't meet you fully, not by your destiny. As you listen to this, notice what feels tender rather than dramatic. The quiet realizations are the real ones, and if something inside you is whispering, "This explains so much," that's your confirmation. Your soulmate feels that same recognition building, because alignment doesn't start with meeting someone, it starts with meeting yourself honestly. The love that's coming toward you doesn't require performance, it requires presence, and your soulmate is asking you to stop rehearsing who you think you need to be and start living as who you already are, because when you do, the path between you clears naturally, without force, without chasing, without confusion. You might feel a moment of grief as this truth settles in, grief for the times you waited, the times you accepted less, the times you doubted your instincts. Let that pass through you without judgment, because that grief is simply the old version of you stepping aside, making room for something more aligned. Your soulmate isn't delayed, they're responding to the frequency you're choosing now, and every time you honor your truth, every time you say no without guilt, every time you trust your inner voice instead of overriding it, you're speaking directly to them, even if you've never met. Stay with this message a little longer, let it integrate, because seeing this truth isn't about changing overnight, it's about choosing yourself consistently in small, quiet ways, and that consistency is what draws your soulmate closer than any wish or affirmation ever could. If this message reached you at the exact moment you needed it, take a second to acknowledge that, and if you feel called, like, share, and subscribe so this energy continues to reach the people it's meant for, and stay till the end of these messages, because what's unfolding for you isn't random, it's aligned, and your soulmate feels it too. The first thing that needs to be said is this: pause for a second and notice how alert you became when you felt something was off. That awareness right there is not random. It's proof that you're no longer consuming words passively. You're listening with discernment now. And that shift matters, because the truth that's unfolding next isn't about destiny language or romantic framing at all. It's about honesty. The kind that feels slightly uncomfortable because it removes the safety net of fantasy and replaces it with self-recognition. There's a deeper layer to what's happening in you right now, and it has nothing to do with waiting for someone or imagining a future version of love. It has everything to do with the moment you started noticing how often you override your own reactions. How quickly you explain away discomfort. How instinctively you soften your truth before it ever leaves your mouth. These are not personality traits. They're adaptations. And adaptations are only useful until they outlive their purpose. You weren't born doubting your instincts. You learned that skill. It came from moments where reacting honestly didn't feel safe or welcome. Where being low friction felt rewarded. Where being understanding felt like the best way to stay connected. Over time, that pattern became automatic. You stopped checking in with how you felt and started checking in with how things would land. That's not emotional intelligence. That's emotional self-abandonment dressed up as maturity. What's being asked of you now isn't to change who you are, but to stop editing yourself before you've even fully arrived in your own experience. There's a big difference between kindness and self-erasure, and somewhere along the way, those two got tangled together for you. You learned to associate love with patience, with tolerance, with endurance. But endurance is not intimacy. And patience is not the same thing as peace. You may notice that lately, your reactions come a half-second later than they used to. That pause isn't hesitation. It's awareness interrupting an old reflex. It's the moment where you catch yourself before minimizing something that matters. Before laughing something off that actually stung. Before saying, "It's fine," when it isn't. That pause is new. And it's important. Here's the truth most people avoid because it threatens the stories they've been telling themselves. Not every painful experience was meant to teach you how to love better. Some of them were meant to teach you how to stop overgiving. How to stop proving. How to stop staying when your inner signal was already telling you the cost. Growth doesn't always make you softer. Sometimes it makes you clearer. And clarity can feel sharp when you're not used to it. You're not becoming colder. You're becoming more precise. There's a difference. Coldness shuts down. Precision tunes in. Precision notices when energy doesn't match words. When consistency doesn't match promises. When affection doesn't match availability. And once you see those mismatches clearly, you can't unsee them. That's why some situations suddenly feel unbearable even though you once tolerated them easily. What's shifting in you right now is your relationship with truth. Not the dramatic, spoken kind. The internal kind. The kind that shows up as tension in your chest, or a heaviness in your stomach, or a quiet withdrawal you can't logically explain. For a long time, you treated those signals as inconveniences. Now you're starting to treat them as information. That's a big change. You may also notice that you're less interested in explaining yourself lately. Less inclined to justify your feelings. Less patient with conversations that go in circles. That doesn't mean you've lost compassion. It means you've stopped trying to be understood by people who aren't actually listening. There's a subtle confidence that comes with that. Not loud. Not performative. Just steady. Here's something important to understand: the moment you stop romanticizing struggle, your standards recalibrate automatically. You don't need to announce them. You don't need to defend them. You simply stop engaging with dynamics that require you to shrink. And that's often when life tests you, not with something obviously wrong, but with something almost right. Familiar. Comfortable. Just enough to tempt you back into old patterns. Pay attention to how your body responds to almost. Almost chosen. Almost consistent. Almost safe. Almost seen. Almost is the most dangerous place to get stuck because it keeps hope alive while draining your energy. And right now, you're learning to recognize almost before it costs you months or years. That awareness didn't come from nowhere. It came from lived experience. You might feel a strange mix of relief and loneliness during this phase. Relief because you're no longer betraying yourself as often. Loneliness because fewer things fit. That's normal. When your tolerance drops, your alignment narrows. And narrowing can feel isolating before it feels empowering. Don't rush to fill the space. Let it stay open long enough for something honest to meet you there. This isn't about becoming hyper-independent or closed off. It's about becoming self-honoring. There's a quiet strength in saying nothing and simply stepping back. In choosing rest over explanation. in choosing alignment over attachment. These choices don't announce themselves, but they change everything. You may also notice that your imagination has shifted. You're less interested in fantasy versions of connection and more interested in how something actually feels in your nervous system. Calm, steady, mutual, safe without being dull. That's not settling. That's maturity. Chaos is no longer exciting when your body remembers how expensive it was. What's unfolding right now doesn't require you to do anything dramatic. No declarations. No ultimatums. No reinvention. Just consistency with yourself. Listening when something feels off. Trusting when something feels grounded. And allowing yourself to walk away without needing a villain to justify it. If you're honest, you already know which patterns you're done repeating. You felt it in the way your energy pulls back. In the way your interest fades when something feels misaligned. That's not fear. That's wisdom catching up to experience. Stay with that. Don't rush to name it or label it. Let it reshape how you move quietly. Because the more you live from that place, the less you'll need external confirmation that you're on the right path. You'll feel it. And if this resonated in a way that felt grounding rather than dramatic, that's a good sign. That's how real change sounds. If you want to stay connected to messages that prioritize clarity over fantasy and depth over noise, you can like, share, or subscribe, and stay with this series. Not everything meaningful arrives loudly. Some truths arrive gently, and change you anyway. There's a moment that happens quietly, usually when no one is watching, where you catch yourself responding differently than you used to. You don't react right away. You don't rush to smooth things over. You don't explain yourself instinctively. And afterward, you realize something important shifted. Not outwardly. Internally. That moment is the real beginning of this part, because it tells the truth better than any dramatic sign ever could. What's unfolding in you now isn't about love arriving from the outside. It's about authority returning on the inside. For a long time, your emotional world was shaped by responsiveness, by how quickly you adapted to others, how fluently you adjusted your tone, your needs, your expectations. You became skilled at reading rooms, anticipating moods, filling gaps before they turned into problems. That skill kept you connected, but it quietly cost you self-trust. You didn't lose your voice. You delayed it. You learned when to use it strategically rather than honestly. And over time, that taught you to second-guess what you felt in real time. You started checking reactions before checking in with yourself. That habit became invisible because it felt normal. It felt like being considerate. But consideration without self-inclusion turns into erosion. The truth you're being asked to sit with now is not flattering or condemning. It's clarifying. You weren't choosing less because you didn't know better. You were choosing what felt emotionally familiar. Familiar doesn't mean safe. It means predictable. And predictability can feel like stability when chaos is the alternative. So you stayed in dynamics that kept you alert, attentive, slightly on edge, because your nervous system recognized that rhythm. Here's where it gets uncomfortable in a grounded, human way. Your system didn't crave chaos. It craved resolution. It kept leaning into situations that felt unfinished, hoping this time clarity would arrive. Hoping this time effort would be met. Hoping this time you'd finally be understood without having to translate yourself. That hope wasn't foolish. It was tired. What's different now is that hope is no longer steering the wheel. Discernment is. You can feel it when something doesn't land the way it should. When words sound right but don't carry weight. When attention comes inconsistently. When connection feels conditional. And instead of spiraling or overanalyzing, something inside you simply notes it and goes quiet. That quiet isn't withdrawal. It's assessment. You're not less open. You're more selective. There's a difference most people don't understand until they live it. Selectivity doesn't mean walls. It means filters. It means not everything deserves access to you anymore. And that can feel strange if you've been used to earning closeness by being endlessly available. You might notice that you no longer feel the urge to convince. Not to convince someone of your worth, your intentions, your feelings, or your patience. The need to be understood by everyone has softened. In its place is a preference for being aligned with yourself. That preference is new. And new things often feel awkward before they feel natural. This phase isn't loud. It's not dramatic. It doesn't come with declarations or grand exits. It shows up as subtle behavioral shifts. Shorter explanations. Longer pauses. Less tolerance for ambiguity. More respect for your own timing. These aren't defenses. They're calibrations. One of the biggest truths emerging now is that emotional safety is not built through intensity. It's built through consistency. And consistency doesn't announce itself. It shows up quietly, repeatedly, without requiring you to chase it. Once you recognize that, intensity loses its grip. You stop confusing chemistry with compatibility. You stop mistaking longing for alignment. You may feel moments of boredom or restlessness as this settles. That's not because something is missing. It's because your system is detoxing from stimulation it once relied on. Chaos creates adrenaline. Calm creates presence. Presence can feel unfamiliar when you're used to emotional movement. But unfamiliar doesn't mean wrong. It means new. Pay attention to how your body responds to calm interactions now. No guessing. No waiting. No decoding. Just steady exchange. That response is information. For a long time, you trusted thought over sensation. You reasoned yourself into staying. Now sensation is reclaiming authority. And sensation doesn't argue. It simply registers. There's also grief here, even if you haven't named it yet. Grief for how long you tried to make something work by bending yourself. Grief for the version of you that believed love required effort at the expense of ease. Let that grief exist without rushing it into meaning. It doesn't need a lesson. It needs acknowledgement. You're also learning that not everything needs closure to be complete. Some chapters end the moment you stop engaging. Some answers arrive through distance, not dialogue. This understanding doesn't make you cold. It makes you efficient with your emotional energy. You're no longer spending it where it evaporates. What's forming in you now is a quieter confidence. Not the kind that performs or proves. The kind that trusts its own rhythm. You move slower. You listen more closely. You disengage sooner when something doesn't align. And you don't narrate these changes to anyone. You just live them. This is where your standards begin to feel natural rather than forced. You're not holding a checklist. You're responding to how something feels over time. Consistency matters. Emotional availability matters. Mutual effort matters. And you no longer feel guilty for needing those things. Guilt dissolves when self-respect stabilizes. You may also notice that your imagination has shifted from what could be to what is. That's a powerful transition. Fantasy thrives in uncertainty. Reality thrives in clarity. And clarity is what your system is prioritizing now. You don't want potential. You want presence. As this continues, fewer connections will pass your internal filter. That's not a loss. It's refinement. The space between interactions may grow. That space is not emptiness. It's alignment forming. Don't rush to fill it. Let it teach you what peace feels like when it's not earned through endurance. The ending of this part isn't a conclusion. It's a grounding. You're not waiting for something external to validate this shift. You're living it quietly. That's how you'll know it's real. No announcement. No performance. Just a steadier way of being. If you feel calmer after listening to this rather than charged or emotional, that's intentional. Growth doesn't always come with fireworks. Sometimes it arrives as relief. As less tension. As less effort. And if that feels true for you, stay with this process. Let it continue reshaping how you choose, how you connect, how you listen to yourself. If this spoke to you in a way that felt honest and grounded, you can like, share, or subscribe to stay connected. Not because you're chasing something, but because you're finally standing still long enough to let what's aligned find you. There comes a point where nothing dramatic happens, no argument, no revelation, no sudden ending, and yet you know something has concluded inside you. It feels almost anticlimactic. You wake up one day and realize you're no longer waiting for certain messages, no longer replaying certain conversations, no longer holding space for possibilities that once consumed you. That quiet noticing is where this part begins, because it marks a shift that doesn't need witnesses to be real. What's changing now is not your desire for connection, it's your tolerance for dissonance. You can feel when something is slightly off much earlier than before. Not enough to cause a reaction, but enough to register. And instead of pushing past that feeling, instead of telling yourself it will resolve later, you let it sit. You observe. That alone is new. For a long time, observation felt unsafe because it threatened attachment. Now it feels stabilizing. You're starting to understand that your energy doesn't need to be constantly in motion to be valuable. You don't need to be engaging, responsive, or emotionally available at all times to be worthy of connection. This realization didn't come from theory. It came from exhaustion. From noticing how often you were the one sustaining momentum while others simply participated. From noticing how tired that made you feel. There's a subtle grief in that awareness. Not the kind that breaks you open, but the kind that tightens your chest for a moment before loosening it. Grief for the effort you gave when it wasn't reciprocated in the same way. Grief for the times you convinced yourself that patience was the same as progress. Let that grief exist without turning it into regret. It's simply information surfacing now that you're ready to receive it. You're also beginning to see how often you overfunctioned emotionally. How quickly you filled silence. How instinctively you reassured others while neglecting your own uncertainty. Overfunctioning feels like care, but it's often control disguised as kindness. Control not over people, but over outcomes. A way to prevent disappointment by staying one step ahead emotionally. That habit kept you safe once. It doesn't need to anymore. What's emerging instead is something steadier. You don't rush to respond. You don't feel compelled to clarify every misunderstanding. You allow people to show you who they are without translating them into something more comfortable. That doesn't mean you're detached. It means you're present without being invested prematurely. This phase can feel unsettling because it removes the familiar role you played for so long. The listener. The supporter. The one who holds emotional space effortlessly. When you step out of that role, even temporarily, there's an identity gap. Who are you if you're not constantly accommodating? The answer isn't something you need to define right now. It's something you're learning to experience. You may notice that some connections grow quieter around you. Not because you've done something wrong, but because the dynamic depended on your emotional availability. When that availability becomes intentional rather than automatic, things shift. That can sting if you're used to being needed. But being needed is not the same as being chosen. What you're cultivating now is discernment without defensiveness. You're not building walls. You're building awareness. You're letting interactions unfold without managing them. You're allowing pauses without rushing to fill them. That space reveals a lot. Who leans in? Who drifts? Who only engages when you're doing the emotional labor? None of this needs commentary. It just needs noticing. There's also a growing comfort with uncertainty. Before, uncertainty felt like a problem to solve. Now it feels like a neutral state. You're less anxious about not knowing where something is going because you trust yourself to respond if and when clarity arrives. That trust changes everything. It takes pressure off every interaction. It returns agency to you. You might find that you're less reactive to inconsistency. Not because you tolerate it, but because you disengage sooner internally. There's a difference. Tolerance keeps you involved while draining you. Disengagement creates distance without resentment. It's not dramatic. It's quiet. And quiet disengagement is often the healthiest response available. This is also the stage where you stop negotiating your internal boundaries. You no longer ask yourself if you're allowed to feel disappointed. You no longer debate whether something counts as enough to warrant a reaction. You trust your response without turning it into a courtroom argument in your head. That self-trust didn't appear overnight. It was built through repeated moments of choosing yourself gently. Your nervous system is learning a new baseline. Less anticipation. Less hypervigilance. Less emotional scanning. That recalibration can feel strange at first. You might even miss the intensity you once felt. Intensity can feel like aliveness when calm is unfamiliar. But calm doesn't mean numb. It means regulated. It means your system isn't bracing for impact. You're also becoming more honest about what drains you. Certain conversations. Certain expectations. Certain emotional dynamics. Instead of pushing through them out of obligation, you limit exposure. You protect your energy without making a statement out of it. That's maturity. Not everything requires explanation. Some things only require choice. This part of the journey isn't about arrival. It's about stabilization. About letting your internal world settle into something sustainable. You're not chasing clarity anymore. You're letting it come to you through consistency. Through patterns. Through how you feel after interactions rather than how excited you felt during them. There's a quiet confidence forming in the background now. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need validation. It shows up as an ease with your own company. As a willingness to walk away from what doesn't meet you without resentment. As a growing respect for your own limits. You may notice that you're less interested in fixing dynamics and more interested in experiencing alignment. Fixing keeps you busy. Alignment lets you rest. Rest is not laziness. It's recovery. And recovery is necessary when you've spent years overextending emotionally. As this part comes to a close, there's no instruction to act, no push to decide, no urgency to move. The work here is internal and already underway. You're learning to stay with yourself without distraction. To listen without rushing to respond. To trust what your body knows before your mind explains it away. If this part felt quieter than the ones before, that's intentional. This is what integration sounds like. Not loud realizations, but steady embodiment. And if something in you feels more settled after listening, honor that. That's growth happening in real time. If you want to continue exploring this space of clarity and grounded connection, you can like, share, or subscribe to stay with these messages. Not because you're seeking answers, but because you're learning to recognize them when they arrive naturally. There's a quieter kind of strength that begins to surface once you stop trying to understand everything immediately. It doesn't come with certainty or confidence at first. It comes as patience with yourself. You notice it when you don't rush to label what you're feeling, when you let emotions pass through without interrogating them, when you allow a day to be heavy without turning it into a problem that needs fixing. That quiet allowance is where this part begins, because it signals a deeper level of trust taking root. You're no longer asking every feeling to justify its existence. Before, if something felt off, you needed a reason. A story. An explanation. Now, you're starting to accept sensation as valid on its own. Tiredness doesn't need a diagnosis. Discomfort doesn't need a villain. Distance doesn't need a dramatic ending. This shift may feel subtle, but it's profound, because it changes how you relate to your inner world. For a long time, your sense of safety was tied to understanding. If you could explain something well enough, you could tolerate it longer. If you could empathize deeply enough, you could stay. If you could reframe it positively enough, you could survive it. That strategy worked when you needed it. But now, understanding without honoring yourself has started to feel hollow. Insight without action loses its grounding. What's emerging instead is self-permission. Permission to feel without resolving. Permission to step back without justifying. Permission to not know what comes next and still feel steady. This doesn't mean you've stopped caring. It means you've stopped managing yourself into exhaustion. You might notice that you're less emotionally available to situations that drain you, even if they once mattered deeply. That doesn't mean your heart closed. It means it reorganized. You're allocating energy more consciously now. You're no longer giving the same weight to everything simply because it exists. Some things are important. Some things are familiar. Those are not the same. This stage can feel strangely empty at times. Not lonely in the obvious way, but spacious. Like there's room where noise used to be. That space can feel unsettling if you're used to filling it with overthinking, planning, or emotional labor. But that space is intentional. It's where clarity settles when it's no longer being crowded out by urgency. You're also beginning to notice how much of your previous emotional effort was anticipatory. Preparing for reactions. Preempting disappointment. Bracing for shifts in tone or attention. That constant readiness shaped how you moved through relationships. Now, as that vigilance softens, your body is catching up. You may feel more tired than usual. Or calmer. Or strangely neutral. That's recalibration, not regression. There's a moment that comes in this phase where you realize you don't miss certain things the way you thought you would. Not because they didn't matter, but because they required a version of you that no longer exists. You're not interested in being needed at the cost of being known. You're not interested in intensity without steadiness. That preference isn't rigid. It's earned. You may also find that your tolerance for emotional ambiguity has decreased. You don't want to guess where you stand. You don't want to interpret silence. You don't want to read between lines anymore. That doesn't make you impatient. It makes you aligned with your nervous system's need for clarity. Ambiguity once felt exciting. Now it feels expensive. This doesn't mean everything must be defined immediately. It means you're paying attention to patterns instead of promises. To consistency instead of chemistry. To how you feel after interactions instead of how much potential you imagine. These metrics are quieter, but they're more reliable. You're also learning that boundaries don't need to be enforced aggressively to be real. Sometimes the strongest boundary is a choice you don't announce. A decision you make internally and honor quietly. You stop reaching out first. You stop offering reassurance reflexively. You stop carrying conversations that feel one-sided. There's no drama in this. Just alignment. This phase often brings up questions about identity. If you're not striving, fixing, explaining, or holding everything together, who are you? The answer unfolds slowly. You're someone who can be present without performing. Someone who can listen without absorbing. Someone who can care without overextending. That identity doesn't need validation. It stabilizes through lived experience. You may notice that your emotional responses are slower now. You don't spike as quickly. You don't crash as deeply. That's not numbness. That's regulation. Your system is learning that it doesn't need extremes to feel alive. Subtlety starts to feel richer. Calm starts to feel trustworthy. There's also a growing honesty about what you want. Not in an aspirational sense, but in a felt sense. You want interactions that don't require recovery afterward. You want communication that doesn't leave you second-guessing. You want connection that integrates into your life instead of consuming it. These wants aren't demands. They're reflections of your capacity. As this part continues, you may feel less urgency to define the future. You're more interested in how the present feels. That's not avoidance. That's presence. You've learned that forcing clarity before alignment creates anxiety. Letting things unfold with awareness creates discernment. There's also forgiveness happening quietly. Not necessarily toward others, but toward yourself. For staying too long. For trying too hard. For believing effort would eventually turn into ease. That forgiveness isn't sentimental. It's practical. It frees up energy that was stuck in self-judgment. This stage doesn't end with a breakthrough. It ends with steadiness. With fewer internal arguments. With less need to prove anything to yourself. With a sense that you're finally moving at a pace your body agrees with. If you notice that you feel more grounded after sitting with this, trust that. Grounding is a sign of integration. You're not chasing insight anymore. You're embodying it. And if these messages continue to meet you where you are, you can like, share, or subscribe to stay connected. Not out of habit, but out of resonance. Some growth doesn't ask to be announced. It simply continues, quietly reshaping how you live, one steady choice at a time. There's a point where growth stops feeling like improvement and starts feeling like relief. Not relief because everything is perfect, but relief because you're no longer fighting yourself. You're no longer forcing reactions you don't feel, or stretching your capacity to match situations that quietly drain you. This part begins right there, in that soft exhale you didn't even realize you were holding until it left your body. You're noticing now that your inner world has become quieter, but not empty. The noise that faded wasn't your intuition or your depth. It was the constant internal negotiation. The endless back and forth about whether you were allowed to feel what you felt. Whether something was enough to warrant distance. Whether you were overreacting or underreacting. That debate used to take up a lot of space. Now it doesn't. And that absence feels strange at first. What replaced it isn't certainty. It's trust. Not the loud, confident kind. The quiet kind that doesn't need reassurance every step of the way. You trust that if something feels wrong, you don't need to rush to explain it away. You trust that if something feels right, you don't need to interrogate it to death. That trust didn't come from positive thinking. It came from experience finally being integrated instead of analyzed. You may realize that you're no longer seeking emotional intensity the way you once did. Before, intensity felt like connection because it kept you engaged, alert, invested. It gave you something to focus on. Now, intensity without steadiness feels disruptive. You don't want highs that come with crashes. You don't want closeness that requires constant recovery. Your body has learned the difference, and once the body learns something, the mind follows more easily. This is also the phase where you stop romanticizing effort. You don't see exhaustion as proof of care anymore. You don't interpret sacrifice as depth. You felt what it's like to give endlessly without being met, and you've also felt what it's like to be met without strain. That contrast changed you. It reset your internal compass. You might notice that your reactions to disappointment are different now. Not sharper. Quieter. You don't spiral as easily. You don't personalize everything. You allow yourself to feel let down without turning it into a story about your worth. That's not emotional detachment. That's emotional maturity settling in. There's a grounded honesty emerging about what you can and cannot carry. You're less willing to hold confusion for others. Less willing to absorb emotional inconsistency. Less willing to stay present in dynamics that leave you depleted. That doesn't come from bitterness. It comes from clarity. From finally recognizing your limits as information, not flaws. You're also becoming more aware of how your body responds to people and situations. You notice when your shoulders tense. When your breath shortens. When your energy drops after certain interactions. Before, you overrode those signals. You pushed through them. Now, you listen. That listening is changing your choices in subtle but consistent ways. This part of the journey isn't about learning new lessons. It's about unlearning old reflexes. The reflex to fix. The reflex to accommodate. The reflex to wait longer than you should. Those reflexes once kept you connected. Now they only delay alignment. Letting them go feels awkward because they were part of how you survived. But survival isn't the goal anymore. Sustainability is. You may also notice that you're more comfortable with emotional pauses. Silence doesn't scare you as much. Distance doesn't immediately register as loss. You trust that what's meant to stay will respond to space with presence, not disappearance. That trust makes you less reactive and more observant. Observation gives you power without aggression. There's a quiet recalibration happening in how you imagine connection. You're less focused on how things begin and more focused on how they continue. Less interested in spark and more interested in steadiness. Less drawn to potential and more drawn to reliability. That doesn't make you boring. It makes you regulated. You're also learning that not every ending needs to be understood to be honored. Some things conclude without clarity. Without apology. Without explanation. And you're okay with that now. You don't chase closure as proof of growth. You recognize that peace doesn't always come from answers. Sometimes it comes from acceptance. This phase can feel strangely anticlimactic. No big realization. No dramatic turning point. Just a series of small choices that align you more closely with yourself. But those small choices compound. They change who has access to you. They change how long you stay. They change what you tolerate without needing to announce any of it. You may find that you're less interested in talking about your growth and more interested in living it. You don't need to explain why you've changed. You don't need to justify your boundaries. The people who are aligned will feel it. The ones who aren't will drift. That's not a failure. It's sorting. There's also compassion here. For yourself. For the versions of you that stayed too long. That tried too hard. That believed patience would eventually be rewarded. You don't judge those versions now. You understand them. They did what they knew how to do at the time. That understanding softens self-criticism and frees energy for the present. Your nervous system is settling into a new rhythm. One that doesn't rely on urgency or emotional stimulation to feel alive. That rhythm may feel unfamiliar, even boring, at times. But boredom isn't the opposite of love. Dysregulation is. Calm isn't the absence of feeling. It's the presence of safety. As this part comes to a close, there's nothing to resolve. No action to take. No decision to force. Just an invitation to notice how different it feels to move through your days without constant internal friction. To recognize how much lighter things feel when you stop negotiating your worth. If you feel more grounded after listening to this, trust that. Grounded doesn't mean stagnant. It means stable enough to choose well. Stable enough to walk away without resentment. Stable enough to wait without longing turning into desperation. And if these messages continue to meet you in a way that feels human, honest, and steady, you can like, share, or subscribe to stay connected. Not because you're searching for answers, but because you're learning to recognize truth when it arrives quietly, without performance, without pressure, simply asking you to stay present with yourself a little longer. There's a subtle moment that happens when you realize you're no longer trying to arrive anywhere. You're just here. Not waiting for clarity to drop from the sky, not scanning the horizon for what's next, not measuring your progress against some imagined version of yourself. Just here, grounded in the present, aware of your own breath, your own pace. That moment doesn't feel like a breakthrough. It feels like permission. And that's where this part begins. You've reached a stage where effort no longer feels heroic. You don't admire how much you can endure anymore. You admire how honestly you can respond to what's in front of you. That's a quiet but radical shift. It means you're no longer defining strength by how long you stay in situations that drain you, but by how clearly you can leave without turning it into a battle. There's a difference now in how you relate to your own emotions. You don't rush to soothe them or suppress them. You let them register. You let them move. You let them pass. That alone changes the texture of your inner world. Feelings no longer linger as long because they're not being resisted or analyzed to death. They're just experienced. That's not detachment. That's embodiment. You may notice that you're less interested in explaining yourself to people who don't truly listen. Before, you would try different words, softer tones, longer explanations, hoping something would land. Now, you recognize when someone is capable of understanding and when they're simply consuming your energy. That recognition isn't judgmental. It's practical. And practicality is a form of self-respect. This part of your journey is marked by restraint, but not the forced kind. The natural kind that comes from knowing what's worth your time and what isn't. You don't feel the same urge to react, to respond immediately, to fill space. You allow silence to exist without assuming it means something is wrong. Silence has become neutral instead of threatening. You're also noticing that your sense of fulfillment isn't tied to outcomes the way it used to be. You're less focused on whether something works out and more focused on whether it feels aligned while it's happening. That shift takes pressure off your nervous system. It allows you to participate in life without gripping it too tightly. There's a grounded realism shaping how you approach connection now. You don't idealize people as easily. You don't project futures before the present has proven itself. You're curious, but not invested prematurely. That balance feels unfamiliar if you've lived in extremes, but it's deeply stabilizing. You might catch yourself enjoying your own company more than before. Not in a performative, I don't need anyone way, but in a settled way. You trust yourself to keep yourself emotionally safe. You trust your judgment more. You trust that if something isn't right, you'll notice sooner rather than later. That trust reduces anxiety more than any reassurance ever did. There's also a new relationship forming with time. You're no longer in a rush to figure everything out. You allow processes to unfold. You let people reveal themselves. You let situations show their patterns. Patience no longer feels like waiting. It feels like observing. And observation gives you clarity without force.
You may still feel moments of uncertainty. That hasn't disappeared, but uncertainty no longer disabilities you. It doesn't send you into overthinking or self-doubt. It simply exists as part of being human. You don't need certainty to feel grounded anymore. That's a big change. This stage also comes with a deepening sense of responsibility, but not of others' emotions. For your own well-being, you recognize that staying in alignment requires consistent choice, not dramatic declarations. You choose rest when you're tired. You choose honesty when you something feels off. You choose distance when closeness costs too much. This choice add up. You are less likely now to confuse longing with connection. Longing often comes from absence of inconsistency. Connection comes from presence and reliability. You can feel the difference in your body. One create tension, the other create easy. The awareness is guiding you more than thought ever did. There's also a softness returning to you that isn't rooted in self-sacrifice. You are kind without being porous, open without being unprotected, available without being depleted. That balance doesn't come from rules, it comes from self-knowledge, from knowing your limits and honoring them without apology. You may notice that your emotional world feels less dramatic, less highs and lows, more steadiness. That doesn't mean life is dull. It means it's sustainable. You are no longer burning yourself out to feel alive. You are learning to feel alive in consistency. As this part settles, there is a sense of completion, but not an ending, more like a chapter closing quietly. You don't need to announce it, you don't need to mark it. You simply move forward differently, with less noise, with more intention. You have learned that growth doesn't always feel like becoming more. Sometimes it feels like becoming less burdened, less reactive, less self-critical, less integrated in dynamic that don't serve you. That lightness isn't accidental, it's on. If you reflected honestly, you will see how much has changed without you forcing it, how your response softened, how your tolerance recalibrated, how your priorities clarified. That's real transformations, the kind that integrated into daily life instead of saying theoretical. As this part comes to a closer, take a moment to notice how you feel right now. Now, what you think, how you feel. If there's a sense of calm or clarity or quiet recognition, trust that. That's your internal compass confirming you are aligned with yourself. If you want to stay connected to messages that respect your intelligence, your emotion depth, and your capacity of grounded growth, you can like, share, or subscribe. Not because you are chasing something outside of yourself, but because you recognize resonance when it meets you. Some journey doesn't need a loud ending. They continue forward, steady and self-honoring, exactly like this story. That's all. I hope you enjoy this story.